So today the topic for myself is boundary marking, and I titled this Boundary Marking 101 and then some. It is a complex little topic and usually yields a lot of questions. So feel free to do questions and we'll work on that as we go. And I'm going to try to kind of keep looking at the camera, but everything's kind of to my left at the moment. So we'll just go with the flow here the best we can. So boundary marking 101, basically we're going to, a little fast. First thing is, why mark your boundaries? That's a question I run into a lot with landowners. And one of the big things to begin with is it's important to know what's yours and it's important to know what's theirs. And I get a lot of questions as a service forester, as an ODNR-Division of Forestry state service forester. What's the most expensive trees out there in the woods? It's usually the ones on the other side of the boundary line. Those are the priciest ones. So knowing what's yours and what's theirs is very important. And again, the boundaries are the first step to being a responsible landowner and to actually getting more enjoyment out of the property for yourself. And again, I hear a lot of stories from landowners about, well, I have ATV riders, I have hunters, I have this, I have that. And all your property line problems start right there at the property line. So the more you can highlight this property line, as you can see in the one picture, the property line is kind of on the right there with a pink ribbon, and the hunting hut on the left is the neighbor's hunting hut with all the shooting windows facing the other person's property. So as you work on boundaries, you get to see some pretty interesting things like this. So the next little part of that is know what is yours is the beginning, know what is theirs is the second part. The last part that I do in there that most people aren't familiar with is know what is ours. And what is ours? Well, that's kind of the weird part. If you study the fence line laws of Ohio, which are attached at the end of this, and we'll get you all the information later on how to do all this, so don't worry. But this next part talks about this. The boundary line issues start with the boundary line trees and fence and so forth. So the main thing you can see highlighted in this little nice little article that I used is boundary line trees that are right on the line are a joint shared property, meaning you own as much as your neighbors do and vice versa. So, and again, in this situation, we start with boundary issues, kind of dictate what happens inside the property. So if you know how to treat the boundary trees, like for example in a timber harvest, who has the right to cut the boundary trees off? If it's a joint shared property, you have to have both partners willing to agree to remove the trees. If one does not, you should not remove them. So, and we'll cover a little bit more of that later. But I also like this quote here from Robert Moore, the attorney that wrote this article, and there'll be a copy of this later as well. Misunderstandings of property law have caused the best of neighbors to quickly become the worst of neighbors. That is very true. Good boundaries make for good neighbors. So that's just what I've ran across throughout my years of doing this as well. And I get to check a lot of boundaries with the Ohio Forest Tax Law. So, all right, going back to why to mark your boundaries. Known boundaries add value to your property. How many of you ever go look at a piece of property, or maybe the property you own now, and when you looked at it, you didn't know where the boundaries were? There's a simple one to add value to your property. Furthermore, when you go to sell the property, again, same principle. You're going to be selling, and it's easy to show people. There is some appreciated value there. So the other big thing I hear out of landowners is, I know where my lines are. Well, the important part of that is do others know where your lines are? Because again, you're not always going to be there. That's nature. We're not always going to be there. So if only one person knows the boundaries, it's kind of not really a good thing for everybody else. It invites a lot of problems. So again, who else knows this important information? Something I like for my landowners to think about. Does your spouse know where the boundaries are? How about your kids? How about your friends? It's a lot easier if you have hunters. If you can say, hey, do what you need on this side of the blue paint, don't cross the blue paint, we're good. So utility companies, things like that, people don't think of that. Foresters like myself, when I go to a property, I really like to be on the right side of the boundary. Again, township workers, county workers, timber buyers, loggers, all kinds of things, invited guests and uninvited guests. It's nice to have that boundary well known so that everybody knows what they're working with, where they're working at, so forth, and it eliminates the honest mistakes. And there are honest mistakes out there in dealing with boundaries. Then there are intentional things. And again, we'll come to that a little bit later. So who can locate and mark boundaries? I hear this a lot out of landowners with excuses of not marking their boundaries. Well, I have to get a surveyor. Well, is that always the case? So the first thing here we talk about is anyone can really locate a boundary when the evidence exists. That's the trick there. Known and accepted boundary proof goes a long ways with the property law in Ohio. And once properly marked, it's very helpful to have that backing of what has always been there. And again, we'll get into some more of the details of that here in a moment. So what happens when you have no evidence? Well, there we are back to maybe it's time for a professional land surveyor. And I always encourage people to go to the Professional Land Surveyors Organization, which will link to their organizations within this document now. Get a good surveyor to come out and do this and put the pins in where they need to be if they're not there, stuff like that. Or in some cases, just the survey is in such bad shape, it's a great idea to invest in a new one. Again, another one that I run into with landowners a lot and traveling around, who can deal with boundary markings, actual boundary evidence, like a pin. The only one who can legally set a pin is a licensed surveyor. The only one who can remove a survey marker, whatever that marker is again, a licensed surveyor. So boundary evidence and markers like that, the important ones are at corners where there's angle changes in your boundary. Those can be anything from cut stones in the old days to pins, to trees, to posts, you name it. And unfortunately, in things like the Virginia Military Survey, it can say go to the whatever tree and make a left and so forth. A lot of that stuff was done many, many years ago, and those pieces of evidence are long gone. So that's, again, kind of leading you to got to get a survey to put that back where it should be. All right, so we go on to how to mark the boundaries after we've got done with why. All right, so property boundaries, step one, get a good map, a really good map, and get the official map. Get a tax plat from the county engineer's office usually, or at least the county courthouse, and it'll be spelled out there as to it'll be drawn by scale, so you'll be able to figure out how far lines are, and it'll show ownership, stuff like that, and you can start figuring out things, how far you got to go in what direction and what you're looking for. And a lot of those maps will have little symbols on them to indicate what you're looking for, and how that is done is that is pulled off of your deed. And again, that's the next step, is how many landowners really know where their deed is or read it. And even better yet, you ever read your neighbors? Sometimes the answers you're looking for are even in your neighbor's boundary marking details, or their survey details, I should say. So again, the deed is very important. It tells you what you're looking for. It tells you where it should be. And it tells you what direction to get there, what distance, and how to go from that first known point to the second one. That is critical. And everybody gets into the debates about, well, can I use a GPS unit to do this, or can I use a compass? Don't get hung up on either one. The only thing I can tell you is if you aren't using either one, the boundary pretty well sucks already. So use either one, get it dialed in the best you can, and find the evidence that you're looking for. So again, we started that word evidence. So the second step is locate your evidence. I prefer, most people in survey work and so forth use pink ribbon to indicate boundary line. So locate all boundary evidence that you can find. Certainly whatever is mentioned in your deed. That is critical. Ribbon things off first. Ribbon can be easily moved. Paint that comes later, not so much. So pink usually is the universal color for surveyors, so that catches our eye out in the woods as well. You're looking for the survey pins. You're looking for old fence line, posts, old fences grown into trees. The metal will be sticking out of the sides of the trees quite often. And I believe if you go back to my first slide, if you zoom in close there, which I don't know if you guys can or not, on that boundary tree, you can see the ribbon sticking out or laying on the ground where the metal grows out of the tree, basically, or not grows out of it, but sticks out of it. And to also help you out, that is a boundary line tree that had a nice wedge cut out of it when somebody was cutting timber and started to remove that tree. So the other thing to note on dealing with your old fence lines, I see this quite a bit out in the woods. People will put ribbon on where the fence falls down. Keep in mind, if the fence is the actual boundary, it's where the fence post is in the ground usually, and that is at the base of it. So 9 times out of 10, the fence is going to fall down the hill, and people will move the boundary over however long that fence is and where it's fell down, 5 or 6 feet off, whatever the case may be. So remember, do not move the boundary lines. That is not what the goal is. All right. Anything that's called for in your deed is a survey marker. So again, like in my example here, go 508 feet, 90 degrees east to a white oak tree. So again, I'm going to kind of help educate this and reinforce this point. Can I remove the white oak tree if I am not a licensed surveyor? The answer is no. Only the licensed surveyor could do such a thing, unless we get everybody on board that owns it and all to agree to it and remove it, and it still would have to be changed in recording. And another good tip for you, if you do get a survey, make sure that the surveyor, when it is done, gets utilized in a deed description at the courthouse and recorded. This is not always a package deal when you get a survey done. And keep in mind that a survey that is done and handed to you that is not filed at the courthouse is no more value than this sticky tab as far as legal description goes. Until it's used in the deed description at the courthouse, it's really nothing that holds water. All right. So the last point here on locating evidence, you should work and build evidence on your boundary marking like a court case, as it may be someday. And what I mean by that is take ribbon and tie it to the tree and then tie it to the metal that sticks out of it. When you find that survey pin, tie some ribbon around it, run it up to a fence line or something sticking out there, a tree, whatever. And for goodness sakes, whatever you guys do as landowners, do not hide the boundary evidence. I have seen landowners take PVC pipe and drive over top of the survey pin so you cannot see the survey cap anymore. You do not want to hide evidence. You want to highlight evidence. So, all right. Step 2 continued. This one's kind of a fun one. And as you can see in the picture, another little evidence. If you look close to the left of the pink ribbon tree on the boundary, there's another shooting hut right on the boundary. So you'll learn who uses your property rapidly when you hang ribbon up. This will kind of get you to speak to your neighbors. As I tell you in this slide presentation, you should talk to your neighbors at the ribbon stage anyway. This will 9 times out of 10 happen whether you want it to or not. As soon as you hang the ribbon up, you'll find out who's using your place and who has an interest in it. They will come and talk to you on a regular basis and ask you what you're doing. So, step 3, locate a good quality boundary paint. An oil-based paint is a must. And put it on with a good gallon can and a brush. Aerosol paints fade way too fast, and you'll be doing boundaries more than you should. We'll cover a little bit of that here in a moment too. Use a universal system of marking and be very consistent. And that's what you're going to get instructions on that within this and the attachments later. For example, the 3 dots in a corner. The 2 dots in the direction on a line tree indicate the direction the line's running through that tree. So it'll be a dot 180 degrees from the first one to the second one, indicating the line runs right through it. 1 dot facing the boundary is what they call a face mark. And again, some of this stuff is kind of neat. You guys have probably all heard about blazing the trail. Well, that comes from the days before we had paint. And that's blazing the trees to scar them to show a permanent mark on the tree. Blazing is a great thing to go along with the boundary paint. If the paint wears out, the blaze will be there. If somebody like myself who's used to looking at tree bark sees it, they'll understand what that is. Okay. So again, this system that I'm teaching you, the 3 dots, 2 dots, and 1 dot, is a universal system that surveyors and so forth use as well. And again, if a surveyor walks through the woods, looks at the corner, sees 3 dots, he's going to understand that's a corner real quick. You'll see how to dial that in even better. Put your dots on the corner facing the direction all the lines run out on it. So if it's a 4-way corner, you should end up with 12 dots of paint on that tree or post, and each one of them would be indicating how the lines run. So, all right. The next little slide here I put together, and you can barely see it, but I wrote on there, this is what I send to you guys as landowners all the time, and it says, do this first. First step, got to know what's yours. There are the written instructions on how to do all this, and I think a lot of you are probably like me. All this talk and so forth is great, but what does it look like? Because I can talk this thing to death, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you see it. So here is our forest tax law diagram indicating the corner there. You can see it highlighted with the 3 dots, and again showing you the line of sight or the direction of the boundary line running, and it kind of starts to piece this thing together for you, I hope. So this thing talks about how far apart to space it. I do not ever measure how far apart the boundary markings are. I only judge it by whether I can see it from one to the next. I do not want to ever have a big gap where I can't see the boundary paint. So again, once it is marked, now what? So in this picture, you can see there's some nice old pink paint on the right and one ribbon, and you can see the old fence line, and it's kind of disappearing pretty quick. So what's really neat is I have a lot of landowners do this. They all are not very happy about painting their boundaries the first time. But it is one thing in my career that I've never had a landowner, after it's done, complain and say that it wasn't worth doing. So this one's always good, and remarking the boundaries later is much easier. So every 3 to 5 years, you're going to be probably remarking that boundary paint, and it depends on how much sunlight it gets and what type of paint you use as to how fast it fades. Aerosols have chlorofluorocarbons in them, and they break down rapidly with the sunshine. So that is why we encourage you not to do aerosol paint. You'll be painting boundaries every year or so, and hopefully you all own land for other purposes other than just painting boundary. So again, times to remark your boundary line. Every 3 to 5 years if nothing's happening. But again, if you have a neighbor who's getting ready to cut timber or something, freshen up your boundaries, and it's a great opportunity to go talk to the neighbor, but more importantly, in a lot of cases, the operator. It could be a gas well company or whatever, it doesn't matter. Talk to the operators and make sure they know where your boundaries are and what your desires are. For example, those boundary line trees that I told you are joint shared property, you can tell them up front, and it's even better to send it to them in a letter. I do not wish to have any of my boundary line trees removed. And then that really will send a message and help keep from running into some unnecessary problems. So, all right. And again, share your knowledge of the boundaries with all that you run across. Everybody has to deal with these boundaries sooner or later. Even if it's just the person who just goes out and hikes in the woods once in a while, understanding what boundary paint means and how it's done is a good thing for everybody across the board. So here are the references I have, just a couple of them there that you can access, and then we'll stick the rest of the PDFs on there, as Dave will coach me through that later. Right now we're having technical issues beyond belief. All right, so that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the last slide. I got to owe a little gratitude to Tim Wilson, who took the picture one day over in Benton County, and that is, I thought, a nice one to end the boundary line talk with. So,
looks like a boundary dispute right there, Mark.
Yep, and if the fence wasn't there, I think they'd settle it out.
Yep, it looks like it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Mark. Very informative. And like Mark said, we will post all of the resources and the video on the Southeast Ohio Wood site, and we'll send you all a link to that as well. I have not been keeping up with the chat box or the questions. So let me make sure, Mark, that before we get off here, we've got your questions.
Hang on, I'm looking at a couple of them here. Let me take the first one from George here. It says, is there any reason not to use orange paint? Yes, in a roundabout way. Depends on where you're at. look around at your neighbors, and I should have covered this, and I did not, and I apologize for that. A lot of times, orange paint, like in our area of southeastern Ohio, used to mean the old mead ground. And at one time, that was open for public hunting. So you got to see what the message is being conveyed by the type of or the color of paint you're shooting for. Again, state land that's open to public hunting and so forth, like state forest, is yellow. So if you're around, say, Zaleski State Forest, you don't want to use yellow paint because people will mistake your property for public ground. Now, with all that said, I will tell you that any paint's better than no paint. Locating the boundary is great. Again, we also, in Ohio law, you do not have to post your property to have no trespassing. It's been brought up lately about the purple paint law. Purple paint in other states is an automatic signal to everybody that that means no trespassing. Right now in Ohio, the way it is, any paint means no trespassing as well. Especially for you hunters out there, that's what you can get the hunting with permission forms from the Division of Wildlife, stuff like that. Again, you can clearly see on those that it is the responsibility of the hunter and others to know who owns what property and to get permission. So really the purple paint thing is okay in a way, but the way we have it set right now, you can use blue paint. If you're into it, you can use pink, whatever you want, you can do whatever. The only thing I would encourage you is stick with consistency. Don't do blue paint on one line, yellow paint on another, white on another. That just confuses people beyond belief. So, all right. Tom had a question here. It says you suggest brush paint rather than aerosol paint. How about the spray gun that you put on a quart can? The quart can is a good oil-based paint, the timber paint. You can buy the boundary paint that goes through those large spray guns too. And if you folks haven't seen them, it is Nelson makes them, and they have a big trigger on them, and it'll shoot out a good 10 feet or so. Those are fine to use as well, Tom, and that boundary paint and that timber paint will last, again, 3 to 5 years depending on the sun. That's certainly fine. So I think I got those two questions done. And then
one
what
just
else?
came in the chat window asking, said they got a 300-acre tree farm with 12 corners. How much will a professional land surveyor cost me?
Well, that's a good question, and it depends on what evidence that you have to begin with and how far they have to go back to do it. And you got to understand that a surveyor's job is to recreate the original line. So if that survey was done in 1930 and hasn't been touched since, and nobody else around has a survey to go with it close by, they're going to have to do a lot of research and a lot of backing up, and that's where it gets costly. One thing you can do to save yourself some money in that world, if you can find a couple of your corners on one line to establish what direction that line went the day they did that survey, to do the degrees of declination, things like that, that'll save you a bunch. The guys that do the surveying will tell you that in a hurry. If you can get 2 or 3 corners put together, that's a big time saver for them, because they can do the math to figure out what the original surveyor was using to go around your property. Charging price-wise, I can't even begin to tell you that, and every surveyor is going to be different, I'm sure.
So one more question, Mark. Can I plant trees on my property line?
Sure you can. And again, knowing what I just told you about it being a joint shared property in the future, I would talk to my neighbors before I planted them there and make sure they're okay with it too, and shouldn't be a problem as long as you look up and don't plant it underneath the power lines and things like that.